Hello, class, and welcome to today's exploration of social identity and intergroup relationships. My name is Dr. Neil Sogi, and I am your instructor for this course. The whole idea within social psychology about how we get our sense of self and how that's very often intertwined with groups is really kind of a fascinating study. How is it that we feel like we belong in a place, to a tribe, to a nationality, to an ethnicity, to a religion? How a sports team can form our identity or impact upon who we are and our sense of self. That all is part of what helps us to navigate through life. It's all about our identities and how they're shaped, not just by our personal experiences, but by our communities and our social groups, and how all of this influences our values and beliefs and our sense of belonging. So throughout this lecture, we're going to take some time and discuss the whole concept of social identity and examine kind of the psychological and social processes that lead us to align with certain groups and distinguish ourselves from other groups. So by the end of this lecture, I hope that you have a good foundation of your sense of self and how you identify yourself within social groups and understand why you identify with certain groups. So within this class, as always, I have a little story to tell about an important individual within the history of social psychology, and then we'll dive into our three main themes. Our first main theme is the idea of social identity theory and the dynamics that arise from group membership. And here we'll explore a little bit about how is it that we categorize individuals into different groups. Why do we do that? And we'll look at concepts of in-group favoritism, out-group discrimination, and self-esteem hypothesis. We'll then dive into what are some mechanisms behind stereotyping and discrimination. How is it that we overgeneralize beliefs about groups and form and persist within these prejudices about individuals and groups, and the ways in which discriminatory behaviors manifest? And finally, we'll dive into reducing intergroup conflict and promoting positive intergroup relations, and look at what kinds of things that we can do in those cases. And here we come to the idea of contact hypothesis, of the idea of recategorization and intergroup dialogue, and why all of these things are so very, very important. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and introduce you to the contributions of an important fellow by the name of Henry Tafel. I call it Tafel. I've heard it called Tajfel as well. But the idea here is this is a person that really kind of is a pioneering figure in social psychology. Tajfel laid the groundwork for social identity theory, which is one of the most influential theories in understanding group behavior and the whole psychological process that drives social categorization. Now, Tajfel was born in 1919 in Poland, and he experienced firsthand the destructive effects of group-based discrimination and prejudice during World War II. As a Jewish man, Tajfel faced persecution and was later held as a prisoner of war. And he experienced, during the war, really deeply impacted his views about identity and prejudice and discrimination, and really kind of motivated him in his work in social psychology. Now, after the war, Tajfel pursued higher education in psychology. He studied at Oxford and then went on to become a professor at the University of Bristol. And in the 1970s, he and his colleague John Turner developed social identity theory in order to explain how individuals form and define their identities based on group membership. So social identity theory really suggests that people categorize themselves and others into groups, and they seek to establish a positive social identity by aligning with groups that boost their self-esteem. So this is where we get the idea of in-group and out-group discrimination. Now, we'll dive into that a little bit later on, so I don't want to give away the whole lecture here in the story of Henry Tafel. But what I want to really kind of highlight is that he's an important person that laid some really fantastic groundwork in the ideas of, first off, what makes up prejudice, but then more importantly, how is it that we can reduce prejudice? How is it that we can promote social harmony? Now, unfortunately, he died in 1982, but his legacy does linger on and is someone that really kind of laid a cornerstone in this whole field. So I want you to kind of always kind of keep him in mind as we go through this lecture. Now, let's take a look at his his primary theory, the idea of social identity theory. As I mentioned, it kind of started off in the 1970s in response to observations of intergroup behavior, particularly prejudice and discrimination, and also based upon his own personal experiences in World War II and his subsequent research on the minimal group paradigm that really kind of highlighted that how strong psychological impact can have on even trivial group distinctions. So the first core concept within social identity theory is this: the idea of social categorization. And that's the process where we classify ourselves and others into distinct groups. It's kind of an automatic thing that we do. And these categories help us make sense of the social world by simplifying very complex social environments. But they also introduce a tendency to view people through the lens of group membership. Now, examples of common social categories include things like race and nationality and religion and professional affiliation. And social categorization often leads to an us versus them mindset, creating a clear distinction between in-groups, the groups we identify with, and out-groups, the groups we don't belong to. Now, after categorizing ourselves into groups, we then adopt a social identity that aligns with that group's characteristics and norms and values. And social identity theory really kind of refers to, or social identity in itself refers to an individual's self-concept derived from their membership in a social group. And this identity influences our beliefs, behaviors, and even our sense of self-worth. So, for example, being a member of a sports team or a national identity group can become a core part of how we see ourselves and how we navigate social interactions. And once we identify with a group, we engage in social comparison, evaluating our group relative to others. Social comparison is a process that helps reinforce group identity, often leading individuals to see their in-group as superior to out-groups. And this comparison can lead to in-group favoritism, where people view their group more favorably, and out-group derogation, where they view other groups more negatively. And this dynamic plays a significant role in fostering group pride and cohesion, but it can also lead to prejudice and discrimination. And one of the central motivations in social identity theory is the desire for positive distinctiveness. That is, we're better than everybody else in this particular way. It's the need to maintain a positive self-concept by viewing your group in very favorable light. So positive distinctiveness encourages people to seek out and amplify the positive qualities of their in-group, as it enhances their own self-esteem and sense of belonging. Now, unfortunately, this often means viewing out groups as less favorable, which can exacerbate social divides and lead to negative intergroup attitudes. Now, social identity theory really kind of has a profound implication for understanding intergroup relationships, because it helps us to see the world through a group's lens. It explains why conflicts arise between different social, ethnic, and national groups. And I think that's why it's so very important. And I hope that you can see how you and I and everybody around us lives in these social identity spaces, and how it can cause some great harm, while it brings us also some comfort. Now, I want to kind of dive in a little bit deeper into these whole ideas of favoritism and discrimination. So I want to kind of start off by talking in terms of in-group favoritism. Now, that's really the tendency of individuals to show preference and loyalty toward members of their own group, of viewing them more positively than those in out-groups. And this behavior stems from the drive to see one's in-group as superior, which in turn supports a positive self-concept and boosts your sense of self-esteem. And this can kind of manifest itself in several different ways. People often perceive members of their group as more trustworthy, more competent, and likable than those of out-groups. In an experiment, for example, people are more likely to allocate resources and rewards and benefits to in-group members over out-group members, and individuals may be more likely to support and defend in-group members, creating a sense of solidarity and loyalty that strengthens group cohesion. By contrast, the counterpart to that is out-group discrimination, which is kind of the counterpart to in-group favoritism, where it involves negative attitudes or unfair treatment toward individuals who belong to out-groups. And so this behavior is often driven by the perception that out-group members pose a threat to the in-group status and values or resources. Out-groups are often stereotyped in ways that justify discrimination, leading people to see out-groups as less capable, less moral, less intelligent. And so discrimination can lead to overt prejudice and hostility toward out-groups, creating barriers to cooperation and understanding. And people may show a preference for social and physical distance from out-group members, often leading to segregation and reduced opportunities for positive intergroup interactions. Now, both in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination are really kind of deeply rooted in our human psyche. Our need for positive distinctiveness, to feel special, the desire to see our group as special and better than others can really kind of lead to a biased comparison where we inflate our values over the perceived flaws of the other group. And this always leads to social divides and intergroup conflicts. So that's something else I want you to kind of keep in mind. Let's look now at the whole idea of the self-esteem hypothesis. And this is the idea that group membership helps us feel better about ourselves. People seek to align themselves with groups that they see as successful, respected, and superior. And this alignment boosts their personal self-esteem, allows them to feel pride and accomplishment and belonging simply by being part of a group. The in-group is successful or prestigious, and members often feel validated and experience an increase in self-worth. By contrast, anything that threatens the status or values of that group is taken as an attack on your own personal worth and threatens your own personal worth, which obviously isn't true, but it's something that we just automatically feel emotionally. And this perceived threat can trigger defensive behaviors such as derogatory comments about others or discrimination against outgroups in order to reaffirm the in-group superiority and restore the sense of self-esteem that we have. So, and that really kind of ties into things like, if we're talking in terms of national or ethnic identities, when those are threatened, people tend to exhibit great hostility toward perceived outsiders to maintain a sense of group pride. And the same thing can happen in the workplace. Employees that feel an increased need to protect the reputation of their work team if it faces criticism, potentially leading to strained relationships with other teams or other departments. Now, while group membership can boost self-esteem, it's also important because people derive their self-worth from it. But ideally, a person should derive their self-worth from many places, not just their in-group status. So the more places that we can derive our sense of self-worth that aren't tied up with these in-group statuses, the more healthy we're going to be in our social relationships, and the less likely we are to be attacking others for kind of inappropriate things. Now, let's go on and explore a little bit about how we come up with stereotypes, how we maintain stereotypes of others. Stereotyping really stems from our brain, because our brain wants to economize the energy that it uses. And social information is really complex. So what our brain tries to do is it tries to categorize it down into very simple terms so that it doesn't have to work so hard, which can be good in a lot of ways, but it really kind of ends up creating some misperceptions when we categorize people, because people are complex, and when you categorize them based upon the groups that they're in and kind of see people as all having the same shared traits and characteristics, it's a broad overgeneralization that does not reflect individual differences. But it's a heuristic shortcut. Stereotypes are really kind of a form of heuristic, which is really just a mental shortcut that allows us to make quick judgments based on minimal information. So, for example, when encountering a new person, we may unconsciously categorize them by visible characteristics like age, gender, or race, and apply stereotypical traits associated with those groups. And stereotypes are commonly applied to outgroups, those that we perceive as different from us. And this tendency is reinforced by that in-group favoritism, which leads us to view our group more favorably and to generalize negatively outgroups. And the thing is, once stereotypes are formed, confirmation bias reinforces this. And what confirmation bias is the whole tendency to notice and remember information that supports our pre-existing beliefs while disregarding information that contradicts that belief. So, for example, if we believe a certain stereotype about a group, we are more likely to pay attention to behaviors that align with this belief and that strengthens this stereotype. And so stereotypes are maintained not only by cognitive biases, but also by social and cultural reinforcement. And they can persist over generations and through many different mechanisms. So, for example, stereotypes are learned through socialization, our interactions with our family and friends and media and social institutions and cultural narratives. Our representations in media also reinforce these stereotypes and normalize and embed them into our collective unconscious. And then we can kind of think in terms of attributional biases. So the idea of the fundamental attribution error that leads people to explain behaviors of outgroup members in ways that support stereotypes. We can also think of this in terms of the self-fulfilling prophecy. When we expect certain behaviors from a group, our actions toward that group can unconsciously influence them to behave in ways that confirm the stereotype. Now, let's understand a little bit about prejudice, because prejudice is what we would call an affective component of intergroup bias. It's an emotional component of intergroup bias, meaning that it is driven by emotions and feelings rather than facts. Prejudice can stem from several sources. We can have prejudice attitudes can be socialized, where we adopt the beliefs and biases of those around us, our social group or our culture. And prejudice is also a natural extension of in-group favoritism, where a preference of one's own group often leads to negative attitudes towards another group. And so prejudice is often linked to stereotypes, oversimplified beliefs about groups. And there's different types of prejudice. There is explicit prejudice, which is a form of prejudice that is conscious and deliberate and often openly expressed. And so individuals with explicit prejudice may feel justified in their views and might act on those prejudices without any hesitation. But not everybody's that obvious. Sometimes there's implicit prejudice, which is more unconscious and often contrary to one's expressed beliefs. And it can influence behavior in subtle ways, even when individuals believe they are acting fairly. And there are some significant consequences, societally and individually, of prejudice. Prejudice can lead to stigma. It can lead to social exclusion and discrimination. There's contributing to mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. It can lead to structural inequality. It contributes to social and structural inequalities by reinforcing discriminatory practices in institutions. And so there's a couple of theories that explain prejudice. One of them is called the realistic conflict theory. And this theory really posits the idea that prejudice arises when groups compete for limited resources. And the competition then creates tension, which fosters negative attitudes and discrimination. Nobody likes tension. Then there's the scapegoat theory, which suggests that individuals and groups displace their frustrations onto vulnerable groups, blaming them for their misfortunes and reinforcing prejudicial attitudes. And then finally, there is social identity theory, which we've talked a lot about here, where we derive our self-esteem from our in-group, and that's always at the expense of the out-group. Now, the important thing here is that we need to try to reduce prejudice and foster empathy and understanding the complexity of other people. And one of the ways that we do that is by bringing these groups into contact with each other under equal conditions. And this is a very important thing, and you might want to write this down. It's called the contact hypothesis. And what the contact hypothesis says is this: bring groups together where they are on equal status. And if you do that and they start to work together, what ends up happening is they start to understand and see the nuances and differences and commonalities between people because they are on equal status. And they start to learn that they are equal, and this then increases empathy and decreases stereotypes. So, one of the best ways is to bring groups together in equal status and to encourage interaction. Positive interaction and cooperation is the best. Okay. Now, while prejudice is the attitude, the affective side of this, discrimination is the behavioral manifestation of that attitude, translating to biased thoughts and feelings into concrete actions. And so let's take a look at discrimination. Discrimination occurs when people are treated differently because of their association with a particular group. And this treatment may be based upon race or gender or religion or nationality or age or group identities. And discrimination can be overt, such as hate crimes or exclusionary practices, or covert, subtle, indirect forms of unfair treatment. And it can take place on an individual level, but also operates within social structures and institutions, perpetuating inequality of a larger scale. Now, there's different types of discrimination, of course. There's individual discrimination, which happens on a person-to-person basis. There's institutional discrimination, where there are different rules for different groups of people, and that can impact how they're treated in housing or education or criminal justice. There's structural discrimination, which is kind of the cumulative systemic effects of social structures and institutions that disadvantage certain groups. And this involves interconnected institutional practices that create barriers to social or economic or political opportunities for marginalized groups. And then there are those mechanisms that sustain discrimination, like social norms, like confirmation bias, like systems justification. And so some of the effects of discrimination on intergroup relationships are that it really does increase group tension and hostility. It creates an environment of us versus them. It perpetuates stereotypes and prejudice. And that has a profound psychological impact because it can lower self-esteem and stress and mental health challenges such as anxiety and depression, and leads people to seek solace in a group, which starts the cycle all over again, rather than simply living in that little bit of anxiety and then connecting with the group outside of your own and being able to find that there is a great deal of commonality from one human being to the other. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and explore a very interesting theory called the realistic conflict theory, which was developed by a social psychologist by the name of Muzaffar Sharif back in the 1950s. And it's really kind of based on the idea that when groups compete for these scarce resources, okay, this is something that I've talked a little bit about already, they develop very antagonistic relationships with each other. Now, unlike theories that focus on internal or cognitive biases, realistic conflict theory emphasizes the role of real objective conditions when you're competing for resources, like, for example, water. There's a driving force behind intergroup conflict. And Sharif's Robbers Cave experiment is kind of this classic study into this theory. And what he did is had two groups of boys at a summer camp who were initially unaware of each other's existence. And when the groups were placed in direct competition through games and contests, they quickly developed hostility and prejudice against each other. And this hostility dissipated only when the boys were later required to work together toward common goals, which highlights both the role of competition in competing and creating conflict and the potential of cooperation in reducing conflict. So you can kind of think about competition as increasing this kind of conflict, and cooperation and all working together toward a common goal as reducing it. Really what it does is it expands the group so that when you're working for a common goal, you all become part of one group, and you are no longer an in-group and an out-group. And so that's the important thing to kind of remember here. The central idea of realistic conflict theory is the zero-sum perception, that where groups view resources as limited and assume that gains from one group will necessarily mean losses for the other. And the whole perception really intensifies competition and leads to the belief that the success of an out-group is a direct threat to the in-group's well-being, which isn't necessarily true in any way, shape, or form. But that's kind of the way the thinking works. And so if we look at it that way, we can kind of think in terms of ethnic or national conflicts. If we just look in the world today, that kind of thinking is very much present. This can happen in economic competition. This can happen in team-based organizational goals. There's a lot of things that go on. So one of the important things for reducing intergroup conflict is what Sharif calls a superordinate goal. That if you have different groups and there's hostility between these intergroups, the way to reduce that hostility is to give them all the same goal to work towards. And at that point, all of a sudden, all of that conflict tends to wash away as they begin to cooperate together towards that greater goal. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing, that we can overcome these intergroup conflicts by seeing a greater goal, a superordinate goal, as Sharif would say. Now, we'll take a little bit of time now and look at the whole idea of contact hypothesis. We've talked about this, but I really, we've walked through this a little bit already, but I want to kind of go back and really highlight it. The idea that we get from Gordon Allport, the idea of contact hypothesis really kind of states that merely bringing groups together is not enough to reduce prejudice. The effectiveness of contact in fostering the positive intergroup relations depends on really 4 essential conditions. First off, that they be of equal status. So for contact to be effective, the interacting groups must have equal status within the situation. When one group has more power or authority, the interaction may reinforce existing stereotypes or biases rather than reduce them. Groups should work toward shared meaningful objectives that benefit both parties. When groups have a common purpose, such as completing a project or solving a problem together, they are more likely to develop mutual respect and cooperation. That there should be intergroup cooperation. When there is intergroup cooperation, that reduces prejudice. When we work with other groups towards a common goal, we foster positive relationships. And that all goes a long ways to helping people to move to a place of equality and care. So I now want to kind of take a little bit of time and turn to recategorization and the in-group identity model. I know I'm kind of bouncing a little around, but it's important to kind of look at all these different parts of this. So recategorization really involves shifting the way individuals perceive group boundaries. So it's encouraging them to see themselves and others as part of larger shared groups rather than separate competing groups. And so this approach aims to reduce in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination by fostering a sense of unity. So, for example, two sports teams that naturally view each other as rivals may see themselves as united if they are both competing against teams from other cities or regions. And this new, larger group affiliation can encourage cooperation and reduce animosity between the original groups. So here again, it's the idea of creating superordinate goals. We want to encourage groups to work together towards shared objectives. And in so doing, we are fostering a sense of unity. So for example, groups within a company might be encouraged to view themselves as part of the company team rather than as separate departments, and that can go a long ways to improving a sense of self. So when we encourage intergroup cooperation, we are encouraging improvement in relationships and reducing the intergroup biases that often take place. So that brings us to intergroup dialogue and the process of empathy building, because these are strategies for fostering understanding and reducing prejudice and promoting positive intergroup relations. Now, unlike other methods that rely on shared activities or goals, intergroup dialogue focuses on very open, very structured conversations that allow individuals to share perspectives, explore differences, and develop empathy for each other's experiences. Now, I want to when we talk about intergroup dialogue, this is really a structured communication process where the different members of the different groups engage in these guided discussions. And the intent there is to explore a sense of identity and bias and privilege and discrimination and start to break down stereotypes and create spaces for respectful listening and mutual learning. Now, a few things to kind of be mindful of here. First off, this is something, the intergroup dialogue should be a place that's safe and have a very facilitated environment, because dialogue needs to occur in a setting where people feel safe to emotionally share openly. So the facilitators are trained in cases like this to make a space that is safe, to have intergroup discussions. And tied in with this is active listening and reflection, because participants are encouraged to listen actively and reflect on others' experiences. And then we can then explore the differences, because when you're in intergroup dialogues, this allows participants to discuss both the differences that they shape their identity and the shared experiences or values that they may hold. And by addressing both unique and common elements, these conversations foster a more comprehensive understanding of the complexities within the between groups. And then finally, empathy building. Empathy building is a really crucial component of intergroup dialogue, because it allows individuals to connect emotionally with others' experiences. So when we feel what other people feel, when we step into their shoes and develop empathy, it involves seeing situations from the other person's perspective and to feel concern or compassion for their challenges. And so in the context of intergroup relationships, empathy can reduce negative stereotypes and increase the willingness to cooperate across group lines. Now, there are a couple of things that you can do here. You can do perspective-taking exercises, where you do activities that encourage individuals to imagine themselves in others' positions in order to develop a sense of empathy. You know, if I were in this position, how would I feel when this was going on? Well, I would probably feel this way or the other. It's also about sharing stories. People are story machines. And in order to humanize someone else and humanize other groups, it's important to hear their stories, to move beyond stereotypes and fostering genuine emotional connections. And then finally, learning about individuals who do not fit a common stereotype of their group can challenge prejudices and views and open individuals to seeing members of other groups more fully. Now, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Let's just kind of dive into a few key themes from this lecture so that you can kind of simplify things down a little bit when it comes to studying. First key term I want you to kind of be mindful of is social identity, which really kind of refers to an individual's self-concept that's derived from their membership in social groups. So this identity shapes how individuals see themselves and how they see others, how it influences their behavior, their attitudes, and inter-group dynamics. And so social identity is a core element in what we call social identity theory, which attempts to explain in-group favoritism and out-group bias. Now, what is in-group favoritism? In-group favoritism is the tendency for individuals to prefer and prioritize members of their own group over those in out-groups. And this preference often manifests in positive biases toward in-group members, including offering them more resources and trust and support while treating out-group members less favorably. And then finally, the whole idea of contact hypothesis, which is a theory that suggests that under very specific conditions of equal status, common goals, cooperation, and support from authorities, direct contact between members of different groups can reduce prejudice and improve intergroup relations. And then finally, our closing question. According to contact hypothesis, which of the following conditions is not essential for reducing prejudice in intergroup interactions? And of those, I would say that it would be C. Physical distance between groups is not essential for reducing prejudice. So, today's lecture, we looked at essentially social identity and intergroup relations. And I hope that you see that it is very complex, but there's some basic core ideas. And those basic core ideas are these things come about because groups help to reduce our anxiety and help us to feel good. And also, it comes about because our brain is trying to economize all the complexity of social relationships. Now, in recognizing those things, we can go a long ways to mitigating some of the harm that can come about by us buying into that as the ultimate reality, and recognizing that the real reality is people are just like us, have the same value as us, and we need to treat them as such, and that we shouldn't be simplifying them down and reducing them down, even though that's what our minds want to do. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Goodbye.